We are on Daf Chaf Gimel Amud Bet 23B1. No?
No, B3.
B3. Okay. Hakoreh b'Torah, one who reads in the Torah, lo yivchot mishilosha pesukim. So we have an advantage here. And our advantage is that we've actually had the chance to look through a crystal ball and see this Mishnah already in passing before. But let's go through the Mishnah as it teaches it us. Someone's reading from the Torah, lo yivchot mishilosha pesukim. You can't read less than 3 pesukim. In fact, how strict are we about not reading 3 pesukim? What did we see? You can't end 2 pesukim before the end, because the guy who comes late and sees 2 pesukim left to the end of the chapter might assume if he leaves early, you know what, the next aliyah is only going to be 2 pesukim. And therefore, you're allowed to read 2 pesukim. Look at how careful we are about this law. So there's a law that you cannot read less than 3 pesukim. V'lo yikra limiturgeman yoter mipasuk echad. And when you're reading for the interpreter, okay, and let's explain what that means. Yoter mipasuk echad. They used to have, when they would read the Torah, they would say, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, Hashem created the heavens and the earth. If you think people want Kol Ram now, could you imagine if we translated every pasuk as we read from the Torah publicly?
The Yemenite shul on the west side that does Shnai Mikra ve'Echad Targum.
Yes, exactly like this. Now, the only difference is, let's be honest, that's a holdover. They're doing Shnai Mikra, they're reading the Pesukim, and then they're reading the translation. But what translation are they reading? Onkelos, the Targum in Aramaic. None of those people speak Aramaic as their mother tongue. Back then, when Aramaic was the mother tongue, it would be like us saying, in the beginning, Hashem created the heaven and the earth. And the land was, They would go verse by verse. So says the Mishnah, when you're reading with the translator, you can't read more than 1 pasuk. Why? So I've had to deal.
Writing. What if the guy knows it by heart, or?
So the translator, this guy's reading it from the pasuk. The translator, translating into English, doesn't need to read it from a book. What we had, which is Morris is accurately saying, is what if the guy had a Megillah in English, read in English from an English Megillah? That would be reading it from inside the book, and you would be yotzeh, as we explained then, if the person only spoke that language. However, what we're talking about now is the Torah. And we're talking about not to fulfill your obligation. We're talking about this idea that they used to have with the Meturgaman. We don't want you reading more than 1 pasuk. I've had this many times. Excellent. There'll be some rabbi coming from Israel, and my father will tell me, or the rabbi will tell me, Rabbi, I'm going to speak in Hebrew to everybody. You translate. Anyway, the guy goes and he speaks for 22 minutes straight. He's like, Ve'achshav Rabbi Farchi. It's Shabbat. I have no notes. I'm like trying to remember. My favorite is when you translate and the guy says, "Ashachachta et achilek." I'm like, thank you very much.
You speak English?
Yeah, exactly. So says the pasuk over here. We're very nervous when we're coming to the translation, and especially in a translation which that was the mother tongue of the people in the community. So you have people who are relying on that guy to understand what the Torah is saying. Imagine you read 2 pesukim and the guy only says half of one, or he skips an important part of it because it's too much to remember in translation. So therefore, we cut it down to ensuring that there's only 1 pasuk. Ubinavi shilosha. How about when it comes to the haftarah? When you're reading it with the translation, then you're allowed to have up to 3 pesukim. Why are we less worried about this? We'll see in a minute. The reason why we're less worried about it is because in Nevi'im, like we've said many times, you don't learn halachot from pesukim in Navi. So therefore, if in the story, in the reiteration of the story, he says it not exactly, I'm not as worried because I'm not learning halachot. I'm not messing up a Jewish practice that's going to come out of this. I was always wondering, by the way, so what happens then if you're in the Torah, in a part of the Torah where it doesn't have halakha, it's a story?
Like for example, what we're up to now. We're reading a story about Avraham Avinu, and you're telling a story. So the same way in the Navi, it doesn't matter because it's not a commandment. So huge parts of Bereshit is not a commandment. So you should be able to read that part of the Torah
with the translator, 3 pesukim at a shot. You know why? Because if the translator forgot something, who cares? What's the answer? There's not a single sentence in our Torah that we don't learn halachot from. Even a random sentence, says the Gemara, Achot Lotan Timna, the sister of Lotan was Timna. We actually learn halachot about proper genealogy, halachic genealogy from that pasuk. So when you learn about Avraham Avinu and the guests, you're learning the laws of Achrasat Orchim from there. When Avraham leaves this way, past week's parasha, Hashem is talking to Avraham, and Avraham leaves, and Avraham says, please, my master, don't be upset with me. Rashi brings that there's 2 opinions. Who is Avraham talking to? One opinion is he was talking to the most prestigious amongst them. That's why he called him my master. The other opinion is Amunai Aleph Daled Nun Yud is not my master Chol, like mundane. It's master Kodesh. He was referring to God. He was telling God, you're here visiting me. I'm having a prophecy. I'm leaving to do the mitzvah. Please God, don't leave. Stanna shwaye. Make yourself comfortable. I'm going to take care of these guests. I'll be back in a jiffy. Okay? What does the Gemara learn from that? Mikan gedola hachnasat orchim mihakbalat penei shechina. We learn that hachnasat orchim is greater than receiving the shechina. So you see, even in the story, there's laws that are being learned. If you get
lists.
Sorry?
We have lists, like when we count the armies, or like when they count the people.
Yeah.
There's sentence after sentence where it's like the first 9 words are the same, and then the last word is, the different name or something like that.
There's a lesson learned from everything. Lesson learned from everything. Now, just to be clear, there'll be times when the lesson you learn will be completely disconnected to what it is that we're learning about over here. Can I give you an example? Let's say you find the word vayehi, like this. And then somewhere else there's a halacha and says vayehi. And the Gemara is trying to figure out, when you say vayehi, are you connecting the first thing and the second thing, or is it standalone? Says the Gemara, some random pasuk about whatever, but you see from the word vayehi, we've just had this numerous times where we proved from random pasukim that a word usage like this would mean in a halachic instance elsewhere that changes the nature of the halakha, because so in every bit of the Torah there are lessons learned. How much more so that we even say that even the crowns at the top of the letters, Rabbi Akiva was able to learn Tile Tilim. Remember that? Tile Tilim shel halachot. So Moshe Rabbeinu asks God, why are you tying these little crowns on the letters? Hashem says there's going to come a scholar who's going to interpret them all, but what does God say? He doesn't say he's going to interpret a lesson. He doesn't say he's going to interpret the storyline. It says he's going to learn mounds of halachot from each crown. So therefore, even one pasuk cannot be, more than one pasuk cannot be read from the Torah without the translation. Benavi shilosha, hayu shiloshan shalosh parashiyot, says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, what if these 3 verses in the prophets that we were just talking about with regards to the Navi, but each one of them is disconnected from the other? There's a machloket what 3 paragraphs means. Either it means that it's actually a separated paragraph in the Torah or in the Navi. Like, what does a paragraph mean in the Navi? Where you have a pei or a samach, right? Where it's patuach or satum. Like, you have, sometimes there's a chapter in the Torah and then there's a space. That's called patuach. Then you have one that's satum, but there's a space in between that and the next chapter, but there's a small space. But that's still a block, a chapter block. There's a machloket if the Gemara over here means that the Mishnah over here is telling you that there's a chapter stop, or it means that there are 3 random different issues, concepts, and therefore it's not appropriate to loop them together when you're giving it to the translator. The Gemara says, Midalgin ben Navi, when it comes to Navi, you're able to skip from one place to the next when you're reading. Ve'en Midalgin b'Torah, when it comes to the Torah, you can't read a part of the Torah and then skip to another part in the Torah. Says the Gemara, Ve'ad kama u'medaleg, how much are you allowed to skip in the Haftarah? Ad kedei shelo yifsok ameturgeman. In order, right, even if it's another page away, technically you'd be able to skip in the Haftarah from here to here. right? But when you give it over and you hand off the ball to the Meturgeman, and he says, the explanation, and the Shunamit came and did this, said this, right? When he then goes and interprets, you have that space of time to turn the page and get to the right place to be able to continue the reading. But if he finishes and you're still turning, that's Torah Tzibur. We don't want the people to be waiting while you're turning the pages, so then we would not skip, then we would not be doing dilug. By the way, for many of us, we're not aware of this happening. Why? Because where you're reading the Navi from, your Machzor. Or you're reading it from the scroll that has printed the Machzor. But many times, we'll skip a few Pesukim. The end of the Haftarah is from somewhere else. So it's further on. So again, remember, on a double level. On the first level, in a regular scroll, which is what they used to read it from, they would need to be close enough that they could get there fast enough that the Meturgeman could not, would not be finished before you finish. That might be itself a good reason, by the way, to read 3 Pesukim in a row. Because if you read 3 Pesukim, then you have more Meturgeman time to find the next spot. Okay, so for us, where you don't have this issue, technically it would not be a problem. Why are we skipping it all?
I was going to ask you that.
Why are we skipping it all? So you have to remember the origin story of why we're reading Haftarah in the first place. The reason why we're reading Haftarah in the first place is because there came a time when they forbid us reading from the Torah. So what did they do instead? They read from the Haftarah. There was no Gezerah. The government did not forbid, the non-Jewish government did not forbid them from not reading from the Haftarah. So they read from the Haftarah. Which Haftarah did they choose? A Haftarah that was connected to the parasha. Let's say you have Haftarah, it's connected to the parasha, and then there's a part in the middle that has nothing to do with it. The whole point of reading the Haftarah was to read something connected to the parasha. It's relevant. So there might be a reason why I would want to skip a piece which takes you off on some tangent, and I want you to stay in the zone. Having said that, I want to share with you an amazing thing. I shared with you this with you yesterday. Rabbi Ari Levine's wife came home from shul last week, whenever it was, when she was alive. He was a tzaddik of Yerushalayim, they were Ashkenaz, Rabbi Ari Levine. Anyway, his wife comes home, she says, we were reading the story of the Shunamit, about this woman, she couldn't have a child, she was blessed with a child dies. She lays the child in the room, she goes to her husband, and she says, I'm going to speak to the Chacham, to speak to the Navi. He says, why? It's not the holiday, it's not Rosh Chodesh, why are you going to the Navi? She says, Shalom. We've all had a moment like that in our marriages, right? Shalom, see you later. What happens after? Elisha comes, he lies on the child, face to face, he says what he says, does what he does, and the child comes back to life. That's what happens in the Haftarah this week. The Haftarah, in the middle, when she says, I'll see you later, to her husband, what does it say? Kan Mesayimim HaSfaradim. The Sfaradim stop reading. Vayomer Shalom.
Yes.
You're in the middle of the story. The kid died. Yes. Now she's going to go get him. He's going to bring him back to life. You're not reading that part? You end in the cliffhanger. Kan Mesayimim HaSfaradim. Someone once said, before you hear about Ari Levine's answer, someone once said, the guy heard his wife say Shalom, Sfaradim are out. Right? However, Rav Ari Levine said the most beautiful thing in the world. He says, you know why Sfaradim and Ashkenazim have to hear to the end? He says, for Ashkenazim, we need to hear exactly how the story played out. Right. The emunah that the Sephardim have is that the woman went to the Navi, she knew it was ready, the story's over. I know it's done because I'm going to go speak to the Navi, the Sadiq is going to sort it out. Hashem's going to take care. The power, the emunah peshuta that the Sephardim had was so straight, was so strong that they could just end that shalom. But you can imagine, my friends, that this idea of midalgim is something that you find all the time. Sfaradim end here, Chabad end here, Ashkenazim end here, right? It's an amalgam of different things. But then you find at the end, and then they add this piece. That's literally midalgim, okay? So the Gemara says, how long can you do it? Until there's a pause. Yes, Jonah.
What about maftir? We switch a section if we're reading a different maftir, if it's like Rosh Chodesh, but we completely switch.
That's not midalgim. We read in order, then we opened up another sefer. The only time you're reading another portion is when you open up another sefer. We don't have a situation where you read from here to here, skip this piece, then read that. Never. Okay? Says the Gemara. Hani gimu pesukim, keneged mi. We actually already had this in the Gemara. Okay? Hani gimel pisukim keneged mi. What are these verses that you have an obligation to read 3 pisukim in the Torah? What does it mean that you have an obligation to read 3? What does that represent? The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yassi. Rabbi Yassi says, keneged Torah neviim ketuvim. It represents Torah neviim ketuvim. I love the implication here. What's the Gemara actually telling us? What's Rabbi Yassi telling us? The reason why you read 3 pisukim in the Torah is because of Torah neviim ketuvim. To represent Torah neviim ketuvim. What is Rav Asi saying? Rav Asi is communicating that there's no possible way to understand the Torah without the larger body of Torah. So you're trying to read the Torah. There was sects in Judaism, the Karaites, okay, the Sadducees, the Tzedukim, the Baitusim, right? They were groups, sects amongst the Jewish people that they only read the Torah. So as an example, what did they do with tefillin? They put tefillin ben enecha. On Shabbat, they would have cold food. They sat in the dark. Why? Because the pasuk says, "Lo tiba'aru esh b'chol moshuotechem." You cannot light a fire.
Take it literally.
They took everything literally, and there was no showing from other places what the Torah actually meant. So therefore, you could have all sorts of problems, misunderstandings arise in the text. So the Torah is telling you, we're learning, says Rav Asi, you cannot read one pasuk in the Torah.
But theoretically, you can't do that without the Torah Sheba'al Peh anyway. So Nevi'im Ketuvim doesn't really solve that problem.
The idea of Nevi'im Ketuvim is already the concept of a wider context of understanding the Torah. Once you widen that context, you're already part of. It's not isolated, exactly. The non-isolation gives across that message, but that's a very good diuk, Stanley. Okay, let's continue. Velo yikra miturgeman yoter mi pasuk echad. You should not read to the miturgeman more than one pasuk. Ubenavi gimel pasukim. V'mayu shloshtan shlosh parashiyot koreh echad echad. And if there were separate issues, each pasuk, then what do? You read them one by one. Kegon, the Gemara says, Kiko amar Hashem chinam nimkartem. Now, we need to see these Pesukim inside. So look in the inside column in the Pesukim. Kiko amar Hashem, you see right at the bottom, Torah Ora Shalem, right at the bottom of the page in Hebrew. You see it's underneath the Rashi, like there. Yeah. Yep. Kiko amar Amunai. Everyone have it? For so says Hashem, Chinam nimkartem v'lo bekasef tigaelu. You were sold for free into a bondage. V'lo bekasef tigaelu, and it is not going to be money that is going to be required to be able to redeem you. That's Nun Bet, chapter 52, verse 3. What's the next pasuk? Sorry, 3. Ki ko amar Hashem amunai elokim Mitzrayim. For so says Hashem your God. Mitzrayim yarad, the Egyptians came down, Ami barishona, right? To Egypt went down my nation in the beginning, Lagur Sham, to live there, Ve'ashur be'efes ashako. And Ashur, the Assyrians, for nothing Ashako took advantage of them. Ve'ata malipo ne'um Hashem. And now, malipo ne'um Hashem, what are you doing here? So says God, Ki lukach ami chinam, Moshalav Ya'alilu Ne'um Hashem V'tami Kol Yom Shemi Menoatz. Look at what's going on. My name is taken in vain. It's stolen, etc., etc. Each one of these pasukim is mentioning something completely different to the pasuk that follows it. So therefore, since the issues are completely separate, it's not appropriate for the Meturgeman to translate all of them together. So how do we read it? We read one pasuk, then the Meturgeman, then the next pasuk, then the Meturgeman, and then the next pasuk, and the next Meturgeman. Now, by the way, this part of the Gemara seems to be a challenge according to the other opinion. Remember I told you that there's two opinions how to learn the Mishnah. Either it means that these Pesukim are different issues, or it means that you don't have, if it's different, paragraphs. But then when the Gemara just now reads this as an example, it says, Kegon. What is an example of different paragraphs? And then it gives you 3 Pesukim, one after the next, which are not different paragraphs. This would seem to support the opinion in the Rishonim that understands 3 paragraphs doesn't mean actual different patuach satum paragraphs. It means concepts, issues, subjects, right? So how would the other Rishonim understand they have a Gemara that literally says not like them? Some of the Rishonim bring this as a proof. So I was trying in my mind to think what would the answer be, and I realized what the answer is. What's the answer? Those Rishonim know the Gemara too. They're just saying that the Mishnah is not limited by the Gemara's interpretation of the Mishnah. You hear?
No.
This Gemara is offering one opinion of how you understand paragraphs. They're ruling in the Mishnah not like this opinion in the Gemara, which limits the interpretation to this. That's how the other Rishonim are learning. You understand? So they would hold from this Mishnah that it's only if it's an actual paragraph, not different sentences. Let's carry on. A person skips when it comes to the Navi.
But wait, they still haven't defined what a paragraph is.
So this Gemara just seemingly defined it, because it gave you different sentences that are about different topics.
So that's the difference.
That's how the Gemara is defining it. And many Rishonim, that's how they learn what the Mishnah is talking about. I was just explaining, according to the other Rishonim, that's not what this means. How could they possibly learn not like the Gemara? Because the Gemara is explaining that Mishnah. And the answer is that they feel there's another interpretation in the Mishnah, and we're not following the Gemara's interpretation of this Mishnah. There are other places where we could learn what this Mishnah means, not like this Gemara. Okay. The Gemara says, we could skip when it comes to the Navi, but you can't skip when it comes to Torah. The Gemara says, hold on, that doesn't make sense. There's another Mishnah that seems to say differently. When the Kohen HaGadol, he reads, remember on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol takes out the Sefer Torah as part of the service of Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol reads Acharemot and Ve'ach Be'asor. And he reads the portion of Ach Be'asor, which is about Yom Kippur. Okay, so he reads Acharemot, which is about the death of the children of Nadav, of Aharon, which are Nadav and Avihu. Why he reads that part is there are different reasons. We'll come back to that in just a bit. Okay, just remind me if I forget why we read that. But these are the two portions that he reads. The Gemara asks, but that is two separate parts. So how does he read this part and this part? Because those are relevant to Yom Kippur. They're not contiguous. The Gemara answers, Amar Abaye. Abaye answers, Lo kasha. Kan bichdesh yivsok aturgeman. The kan bichdesh lo yivsok aturgeman. When is it a problem? The problem is when you can't get from one to the other fast enough. But when the miturgeman, while he's translating what the guy read from the Torah, there's enough time to get to the other part, you could get to the other part. Now, let's just be clear. This is clearly not like the Mishnah. Can someone tell me why? We saw this differentiation. Sorry?
The Mishnah says you could skip in the prophets.
Excellent. This loophole of within the amount of time of the translator was only within the prophets. We gave a blank no when it comes to the Torah. Ask the Gemara, what are you talking about? Ve'ala katani. It says specifically in our Mishnah, midalgin benavi ve'en midalgin b'Torah. Regardless of ve'ad kamo midaleg ad kadei shelo yifsok miturgeman. Michlal, when are you allowed to skip? How much are you allowed to skip in the prophets? Only the amount that it takes the time of the miturgeman. Michlal, we learn from it about Torah. That when it comes to Torah, there's no pause whatsoever. There's even with a zero pause, you still can't skip. The Gemara answers. Abaye says, no, you're right. Lo kasha. We're gonna remedy this contradiction by saying, kan b'inyan echad. The Mishnah is talking about inyan echad. When you're talking about one thing, one topic, one inyan, then you're allowed to skip. Kan b'shtei inyanot. When are we talking about? We're talking about when you're skipping from two different subjects. You can't skip at all in the Torah. Now, what's the connection between, why are these the same subject when it comes to the Kohen Gadol? So in other words, the Mishnah that tells us that you could skip is the Kohen Gadol's reading. Why are those things read on Yom Kippur? What's the connection between Yom Kippur and those two things? Yep. So Ach Be'esor is about Yom Kippur. What's the connection of Acharemot Shnei Bnei Aaron?
They did it on Kippur.
So if you're going to say they did it on Kippur, that would be a good enough answer. But that's not universally accepted. In fact, we know exactly what day this happened.
because they went into Kodesh HaKodashim?
On what day?
On you?
The
No.
inauguration of the Mishkan.
On the 8th day of the inauguration of the temple. What day was that? Not Sukkot. We know that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is given 10 crowns. One of the crowns is the inauguration of the temple. So it would have been in Nisan when this happened because it was on the 8th day. Vayihi b'yom hashemini. So there's two ways of looking at this. One way of looking at this is because we say that, according to many opinions, they brought the Ketoret and that's what got them killed. According to some opinions, not only they bring the Ketoret, which is supposed to be only in the Kodesh HaKodashim, only on Yom Kippur, only with the Kohen Gadol, which, by the way, the Pasuk then continues and says, they went in a way that wasn't allowed. The only person who's allowed to do this is the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So the end of the story, even though the beginning of the story is not on Yom Kippur, the end of the story is, this is the only person that's allowed to do it. There's other opinion that says that when they brought the Ketoret, they didn't bring the Ketoret outside of the Kodesh HaKodashim, they brought it into the Kodesh HaKodashim. So they did a Yom Kippur service, even if it wasn't on Yom Kippur. That's the first answer.
But didn't they know that they couldn't do that?
They did know.
So why would they do that?
There's 7 different reasons why what the mistake was. According to one opinion, it was that they were drunk, but most opinions actually say that that's not what's going on, because the literal answer in the pasuk says "Bekorvam esh zara." What did they want? They were jumping a fence, Morris. What they were doing was they were going to a place where they were not allowed to go. And there's a beautiful interpretation. There's different explanations as to what they did. One of the explanations is they drank wine. Another explanation is that they decided never to get married. So they could give all their time to the service of God. Another explanation is that they said, when will Moshe and Aharon die so that we could take over the leadership? Al Chachamim explained that all of their mistakes are actually come from the same place. A desire to push themselves forward, closer to God, to a higher level of Kedusha than they were actually ready for. So what did they go to do? They said, Moshe and Aaron are the leaders, we want to be in their place. When are they going to die so we can take that place? Not because they want them to die, because they wanted that Kedusha, the responsibility, the zechut of leading Am Yisrael.
Very Korach-esque.
In a certain way, except that Korach, we have a rishut, a negative that's associated with his intentionality. When it comes to Nadav and Avihu, we know that everything is bekorvam esh zara. Their desire, the word korvam means to sacrifice, but it also means coming close. So in everything that they were doing, they were trying to push the envelope to go. And at the end of the day, closeness with God is not up to you. It's up to Him. And only He can decide if you're supposed to do that, if you merit to do that. Yes?
How come there's no opening since Aaron had just allowed the golden calf sin, and this follows the soon after Parsha in terms of his son's dying?
I'm not understanding the question.
Aaron had allowed the golden calf by saying, let's put in a golden calf, don't
Okay.
do worse. And then soon after, the next Parsha, the Parsha after his son's died.
So I'm trying to understand.
Connection that
Maybe the answer is that that's what happened to Aaron, that they were punished because of him. Is that what you're asking? Maybe. I'm not saying not.
I'm not saying you're not, but they're not saying it.
No, but maybe that, again, I don't know that that's true or not. But let's say it was true. The Gemara doesn't necessarily, when it mentions something, say all the things that it wants to say about that one subject. The Gemara kind of, you find random pieces about things all over the place. There is, by the way, an opinion that says that the punishment of Aharon, Moshe is able to mitigate it for Aharon. But he was not able to mitigate it that there shouldn't be a punishment, and the punishment was Nadav and Avihu. That's one opinion that says that, okay? But
I thought you don't punish your children or the children on sins of their father.
excellent question. Excellent question.
Correct it.
So maybe that's part of the answer. So in other words, they brought something that was Esh Zara. Aharon had some mistake involving Avodah Zara, this foreign service. So to speak, if they don't correct it, Stanley's right. If they do correct it, they're punished for their own sin and the sin of their fathers. The standard answer, though, to Ray's question would be that even if there's kapara for the father, when the son will do something that he's culpable for, So then he'll get punished. But otherwise, if Aaron was complete scotch clean free, then they may have been forgiven for it. So it's not that you're paying his price, you're paying your own price.
You didn't have the protection.
But you don't have that extra layer of protection. Exactly. That's a standard answer that they would give to that question. Okay, so the second answer is, what's the connection between Acharemot? So one answer is, we're teaching you laws about Yom Kippur, about Kodesh Kodashim, about who's allowed to go into the Kodesh Kodashim. And as well, simultaneously also reinforcing amongst the people, guys, it's Yom Kippur. Make sure you're standing where you're supposed to be standing. Don't venture into places on this day where you're not allowed to be, okay? So it's almost a warning. But the second answer is, we actually read, even to this day, after the Sefer Torah, what do we read? We read about, there's a whole song about the Shnei Bnei Aaron. Why? Because the Gemara says that on Yom Kippur, what are we looking for? We're trying to get kapara from God. One of the most powerful kapara that we have in the Torah is mitat tzadikim, when the righteous die. When the righteous die, it's a tremendous kapara for the generations, for the people, and therefore we're mentioning that they passed as a kapara for Am Yisrael even to this day. And that's why I pushed back when you said Korach-esque. Because no one's mentioning Korach's mistake as a zechut for kapara 3,000 years later. Even to this day, we're mentioning the death of the tzaddikim, and it says, especially if a person can bring themselves to tears, if they could cry, the Gemara says, Kol amorid demaot. If a person cries at the funeral of a great tzaddik, mochlino al kol abonotav. Wild. Because he's connecting to the death of the tzaddikim and he feels that pain. The death of the tzaddikim is even compared to the destruction of the whole temple. Okay? Let's move on. So therefore, it is one inyan, and since it's one subject, says Abaye, that's the answer to this problem of why you're allowed to skip when it comes within one topic. Okay. However, when it would be two topics in the Chumash, even if it was one pasuk later, even if it was instantaneous, no skipping, no silence after the Meturgaman at all, just to go from one to the other would already be a problem, and you would not be able to do this.
Okay.
Now,
Sorry, but here wouldn't it be? It's because the pesukim are not close to each other. Isn't that an issue? Even if you're skipping?
What do you mean they're not close to each other? They're one following the next.
No, not in this one.
What do you mean?
That one's in Vayikra,
Okay.
Tav Zayin, right? And the other one's in Kaf Gimel.
You're saying it's far.
Yeah.
No, so I think that's what Abaye is trying to communicate over here. When it's one subject, and you're reading, because that's the subject of the day, so to speak, that's the connection, it's not a problem that I have to get from one to the other. Okay? Now, by the way, what's interesting here is that the Gemara doesn't say that the Kohen Gadol had two Sifrei Torah. It doesn't say that.
Which means you have a pause.
Which means that there's going to be a pause. I'm supporting his question. And still, that's okay. So initially, Abaye was saying, when is it allowed when there's no pause in the Torah, just like in the Navi? When it's over here, when we come to the second answer of Abaye, we don't have to assume that Abaye's answer in his second answer is built upon his first answer. Do you understand? There's two ways to read this Gemara. One way is Abaye was saying, just like in the Navi, you could read, you could skip if you could do it without any pause. So also in the Torah. Now the Gemara knocks that out from the Mishnah. Now Abaye answers on that answer, right? Yeah, but there's a difference. That's two issues. This is one issue. One way of learning the Gemara would be that Abaye was saying, no, it's true what I said before, that it's within a pause. But when it's one issue, when it's a pause that's not noticeable, you're allowed to do it. Why are we deciding that it's not the case, that it's one built upon the other?
They want to get the point across.
So let's look back at the Gemara 1 second. The Gemara says, Ela Amar Abaye. What does Ela mean? Rather. You see? Rather. Ela means or only. It's not that Abaye is continuing and explaining, no, you didn't understand my first point. My first point meant this. he's not continuing, he's answering another answer. Okay? So once he's answering another answer, it's not a problem that there's going to be a pause because, they reference Yom Kippur, and therefore you can move from one to the other, no problem. Okay? Let's continue. Says the Gemara, V'atanya, and we're going to prove this, Midalgin b'Torah be'inyan echad. The Braita says explicitly, you skip in the Torah in one issue, u'benavi b'shnei inyanim. And when it comes to Navi, you're even allowed to do it with two different topics. Kan v'kan, b'chdei shelo yifsok ha'meturgeman. Here and here, it needs to be when there's no pause for the meturgeman. Okay? So what did the Braita just do? The Braita seemingly now just knocked out what we just said and said that the requirement in the Torah, even in one issue, is still only when the meturgeman would not be pausing. Tanya idach, another Braita says, you don't skip from one Navi, one prophet, to an entirely different book. Okay? In the prophets. But within the 12 prophets book, midaleg, you're able to skip. You're not allowed to skip from the end of the book back towards the beginning. That you can't do. When it comes to Shnei Asar. Now, by the way, this answers a famous question. If you go to the shelf, you'll see you have Yehoshua, you have Shoftim, in the beginning. But after you hit a certain point, then it goes, you have Yeshaya, you have Yirmiyah, right? You have different Nevi'im, each one gets their own book. How come when it comes to the 12 prophets, they're all in one book?
Just so that they can,
They're all each their own book.
just so that they can bring them together.
This is the nafkamina that it's called Trei Asar. You got that?
No.
The relevance of codifying those 12 as the 12 prophets is that the 12 prophets are considered one book with regards to being able to skip from one Navi to another Navi in the reading. So there's a halachic ramification to the fact that it's called Trei Asar. Okay? So you would not be allowed to read it backwards. All right? So how do we come out now? Are we following this Braita? Yes or no?
When do we ever read a Navi as opposed to studying?
Well, every Shabbat. So the Haftarah is the Navi.
Oh.
Right? So when you're reading in the Navi, but you'd be reading a certain part, and then you'd skip sometimes to a few verses later, or to something much later. But the Gemara says you can't skip from one book in the Navi to another book. But what you could do is you could go within one book, you could go, you could go to a later place. You can't go backwards in order, but you could go further ahead to another place. I wonder, by the way, what is the case, what's the halacha with Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet? Or Melachim, is it like Trei Asar?
It was split after, the Goyim split it, no?
I don't know who split it. I'm not sure. But I would imagine yes. I'd imagine that it's fine because of for the same reason. Okay? We can double check that and see if that's the case. But I believe that is the case. They say a famous joke about the tour guide. He tells everyone on the bus, he goes, oh, Shmuel is buried here. And later on in the trip, he tells everyone, he's like, oh, Shmuel is buried here. The G in the back, she says, didn't you already tell us before that Shmuel was buried somewhere else? He goes, yeah, Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet. Okay. Now, should we start? Oh no, we're already done. Okay. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.